Hello, everyone, and welcome to our latest AFSP Town Hall, Mental Health in Asian American Pacific Islander Families, Reconciling Culture and Identity. I'm Dr. Christine Yu Moutier, and I serve as AFSP's Chief Medical Officer. And I am just thrilled to be joined by esteemed panelists and experts in this space. So let me go ahead and bring them in. First, I want to introduce to you Dr. Jenny Wang. She is a psychologist and an expert in this area. She has recently authored a book called Permission to Come Home: Reclaiming Mental Health as Asian Americans. And she also does many other things, advising various coalitions and things operating in the national arena. And she's also convened an Instagram community, as well as a mental health resource guide online for Asian American Pacific Islander individuals and populations. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Becky Wong. She is the Clinical and Scientific Director of Otsuka Pharmaceutical Development and Commercialization. And she is the founder of Otsuka's Employee Resource Group, focused on Asian American Pacific Islander needs and mental health needs. And that group is called Inspiration. And last but not least, I'd like to introduce Dr. Howard Liu, who is a tenured professor and chair of the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Nebraska Medical Center. He is a leader in medical education and a whole variety of other topics as well, including things like social media and technology in mental health, gender equity, as well as AAPI equity, and specifically working with healthcare and health system leadership around AAPI equity. So I really want to welcome everyone and give you a chance to say a little bit more about your background. And so maybe I'll start with you, Jenny, and ask each of you to say maybe just a couple of things about your background or your personal experience as it bears on this topic of AAPI communities and mental health.
Sure. Thank you so much, Christine, for bringing us together. This is such an exciting topic. So I am, I guess I would say, a 1.5 generation Taiwanese American. So I was born in Taiwan, but moved to the United States when I was 2 years old. So I was primarily raised here by immigrant parents. And, you know, I think the topic of mental health was always shrouded in silence, to be honest. There were stories, there were murmurs, there were things spoken behind closed doors, but it was never something that was directly addressed. And so I think part of this conversation, why it's so important, is we're bringing what's not spoken into the light, right? And I think for our community, when there's a lot of shame surrounded around mental health, bringing those topics out into the surface is so important.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Dr. Liu, Howard, let's go to you next. And just a couple things from your background. Would love to get to know you more.
Sure. Thanks so much, Christine, and thrilled to be here. I'm a second generation Chinese American. My parents are both Chinese, but born in South Korea, which just shows there's an ongoing diaspora, right? And a lot of diversity within our community as well. I grew up mostly in the Midwest in Iowa, and currently I'm chair here at University of Nebraska. So I've really mostly been in the Midwest. And I would say for my identity, a lot of it was learned in college. You know, I certainly learned it from my parents, but learning the history was so important. And then in med school, I remember it was the 9/11 attacks occurred. And there's this backlash of terrible hate crimes that have happened across the country, including some affecting the Sikh Americans and South Asians in the Michigan community. And that's really was an awakening for me, planning a hate crime symposium to bring attention to that. And it was also the 20th anniversary of Vincent Chin's murder, who was another singular figure in Asian American history as well. So I think that really helped catalyze my interest. More recently, the pandemic, unfortunately, has caused some more backlash and stigma against Asian Americans. And I think it's been a difficult time for mental health for many. And just being a father of 4 kids, I've really been thoughtful about, you know, how are they experiencing that in middle school, high school, elementary, and what can we do proactively as parents to really make sure that they have the resources they need.
That's amazing. Thanks, Howard. Becky, let's go to you.
Thank you, Christine and AFSP, for inviting me to join this wonderful panel. So I am a first-generation Cantonese Asian American. I like to call out Cantonese because we know the AAPI community is full of different diverse culture. And one of the reasons why I want to participate in this panel is, given that I am a first-generation Asian American, oftentimes, as Jenny pointed out, a lot of the experience are usually not disclosed. Some of the racial discrimination that they have endured, they don't share those information with us, but we do experience it on our own. One of the things that I have been working on is that many of us are spending a lot of time at work, more than we are with our family. And it's important to get the support of our employers and our organization to support our community as well. And therefore, I'm very happy that we were able to establish an employee resource group to really help the AAPI community, not only to support them, but also to make them feel that they're inclusive in our company.
That is fantastic. Thanks to all of you for sharing that. And I forgot to share my own background in this. So just briefly, before we get into more of this discussion, I'm half Asian. My father is Chinese, born and raised in Hong Kong, and then came to this country when he was 19 and met my mother, who is Swedish American. And growing up, I did grow up in I would call it a dominant Asian culture household, and with family values that were very much around being extremely productive, making every use of every moment of your time, no waste, being the best or the best you can be academically. For me, that meant academically and with my piano life. And so, and that's common in many, many families to emphasize achievement and status. I think the other part of it that was particular to my upbringing that I believe is common to many Asian families and probably other families as well, is that especially negative emotions, as I was growing up as a young girl, if I felt sad or anxious or angry, there was really no way to express that in a way that was welcome in the home environment. And, my parents loved me, loved my brother, and were doing the very best they could, but they were perceiving those emotions and expressions of emotion as something that needed correction. And, I would be sent to my room if I felt upset and was showing tears or something like that. And again, I know it's out of the best of intentions, but would come across then as a punitive sort of consequence that you just learn very quickly as a child, that to please your parents and do well in life, that you learn how to suppress emotions and just stay very, very zeroed in on productivity and working hard, being disciplined. And for me, that worked all the way through the middle of medical school until then suddenly it didn't work because I hadn't learned how to process difficult emotions. And that led to a whole host of other mental health struggles that thankfully I was able to get the help that I needed at that time. So I do have my own lived experience of mental health struggles and even being suicidal. And, I'm happy to say that my parents and my, Chinese side of my family have grown so much in terms of several of us actually ended up going into mental health. And it was a very, initially, like, I thought you were going to med school to be a doctor type of response, but then very quickly came along and realized there's a science behind the brain and behavior and mental health and so many things kind of burgeoning in the field. And so that's a little bit about my own personal experience. And then once I was serving as a dean in a medical school, I then was in the place to be advising many students, some of whom were of Asian heritage, and especially those with physician parents, but also cultural factors such as Asian families. I would hear things from medical students like this: it's better for you to tell no one that you are suffering the way you are, having suicidal thoughts. Don't tell anyone. These all could jeopardize your position in the school or your academic career. And of course, we know that so much of the work of suicide prevention and mental health advocacy is actually about disclosing what we're going through safely and to the right people, but to not live with it and suffer in silence. So that's just a little bit about my background. And so again, thanks to each of you for sharing from where you sit. I would love to learn a little bit more from each of you in terms of, I'm thinking about both the personal experiences that you've had either in your family of origin or now current day, but also thinking about the professional hats that you wear. And I know most of you have multiple professional hats. And if there are some themes that you are finding yourself advising others, or if it's clinical work, Becky, if it's the employees at your company, I would love to just understand more about some of those themes that you are seeing. And really, I'm thinking about things like generational differences in an understanding of mental health, whether there are barriers or opportunities. Where are the strengths that you're seeing in AAPI culture? And similarly, I think, those who are gathered here with us today are probably coming because there's an interest in learning more about a way forward and through some difficult situations. So please, let's have a free, wide-ranging conversation about that. Becky, I see you're coming off mute, so let's start with you.
Yeah, I'll chime in first. But as you point out, Christine, and something that I share with the team here is that we spend more time of our day with our colleagues than with our family. So being supported by our organization and raising awareness of AAPI-related issue is pertinent in regards to our well-being. As Howard pointed out earlier, with the pandemic, there was a lot of hate crimes that occurred among our community. And I'm really proud that our company was at the forefront of ensuring that, our colleagues are safe in certain areas that had higher incidence of reported attacks. And then also on top of it, start developing employee resources group that can support and for us as employee to leverage some of those resources. Within my company, we're really focused on mental health. And the reason why I got into the mental health space, I actually started out my journey as wanting to be a pediatric pharmacist. But after my rotation, I realized that there was a huge need in the psychiatric field. There was no AAPI, clinical psychiatric pharmacist, 20 years ago in the greater Philadelphia region in the inpatient setting. And for me, when I joined and enter into my rotation in a psychiatric facility, it was like an aha moment for me. It was a moment that I realized that we need to have more presence and more individuals that represent the AAPI community that is in the front line of mental health service and providing mental health service to these individuals that were really in a vulnerable state when they're in the inpatient setting. So that's one of the biggest reasons why I decided to pursue and enter the psychiatric field. However, one of the drawbacks with entering this field is that, one of the big issues I encountered was stigma. Not only was my family questioning my decision that I was going into the psychiatric field, I myself had experienced some of my colleagues who asked and questioned my decision as well. So one of the biggest barriers that in my early profession is the lack of awareness and acceptance of the psychiatric profession among our community. and how that can really harbor and foster stigma among this profession. And with that, it's unfortunate that there is a shortage of healthcare providers in this space. And I'm hopeful that, with the town hall that we're having today and with more awareness that we can increase more AAPI healthcare professional in this space so that we can help more of our community that is suffering in silence.
Absolutely. Jenny, is this resonating for you?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, Becky had mentioned that there aren't individuals, or there at the time when we were entering these professions, there were not individuals who even could mentor us, right? I remember being in graduate school and thinking it would be wonderful if there was an Asian American psychologist that I could really look up to, that could help me navigate what graduate school is like and applying for internship and all these things, because I was the first to go to college from my family. And so these ideas of being a first gen, right, being eldest daughter, child of immigrants, they impact and shape the way that we feel we need to show up. And so one of the themes I find clinically that Asian Americans in particular really need to understand and kind of figure out for themselves is the self versus other relationship. Because in Asian culture, we highly value the others in our lives. Mm-hmm. What our parents think, what our community thinks, right? What our colleagues think. And that's not a bad thing. It's actually really lovely. It's really beautiful, right? Even in how we engage with our elders, how we defer, we bow, we may give honorific, right, engagement to. And that's beautiful. But held to its extreme, we might feel stuck, because if we are held to other people's expectations, we might need to feel like we need to betray ourselves, right? And so even with mental health, there's this idea that I don't want to overburden others by telling them how I'm struggling. I don't want my parents to worry that I can't get out of bed to study for school because I have depression, right? I'm struggling with depression. And so that idea that self and other can coexist, that I can be fully myself, even in the context of loving others, and how to navigate that space is also really difficult. So that's something that I find a lot of clients are having to understand and try to figure out for themselves.
That's so deep and so remarkable. And you're just really, making me realize that for so many of us, part of the journey, and I wonder how much of this is influenced by growing up in Asian culture, is this, but again, it is a universal experience, the need to become fully yourself with that boundary that you get to breathe the air around you because you're simply alive, not for the sake of obligation or for pleasing others only. That self and other relationship is huge. Howard, some thoughts on that or anything?
I just really resonate with what's been said so far, both Becky about being one of the first or the only entering this space of mental health or in leadership role. And, Christine, also with your own experience too, about what you said about, is psychiatry really a part of medicine as you're thinking about these fields? And then Jenny, the self versus others. I think those are all fundamental. Growing up in West Des Moines, Iowa, as I did, there weren't a lot of Asians in my high school. And so really, it wasn't until college that I learned a lot of the stories. And I think a lot of the pride of really ownership of that identity comes from learning. And a lot of this is not taught, right, even today in high schools. Very few states, I think a couple have passed some recent bills to talk about the requirement of Asian American history as part of the K-12 curriculum. But I think that we internalize this absence sometimes of knowing some of these stories, some fundamental moments, like the killing of Vincent Chin, what that meant for the forging of Asian American identity, those kind of things. And I would just say that as I've become a parent, I see those things and feel them in a different way than I did even as growing up as an individual. And for my own kids, I try to expose them to some of these stories, these amazing documentaries that are out there. I listen to a podcast, Asian American History 101. And a lot of these things are things I'm learning for the first time. There's a quote I like from an actor, Yvonne Chapman, and she says, we subconsciously internalize our omission of our faces on screen. And I think that works for so many spaces, whether it's a senior leadership space, dean, chair, CEO, whatever it might be. But to say we don't see other people that look like us, and how do we really break through? How do we support each other? I would say one tool I've found in my own career in life is that social media is a great equalizer. And if you use the direct message feature, it's a way to connect to really diverse leaders all across the country, internationally as well, that might share your philosophy, help you along the way. So that's really been helpful for me.
And Howard, you're really incredible at not just, using social media as an educational tool, but at actually developing community through that. And Jenny, you as well. So that is remarkable. I am thinking about, the folks who are participating with us today, the roles that they are in as parents, as teachers, as youth workers, leaders in organizations. I wonder if we could move a little bit into the issues that we're experiencing, but how you've found a way to help the people in your life, whether they're clients or colleagues, improve. Are there specific advice that you would like to give to others? You can start with any of you. Jenny?
I always say that building up our tolerance for discomfort is one of the most powerful tools, right? Because there's discomfort in all areas of our life, right? When my daughter came home and said somebody pulled their eyes at her, right? That was discomfort. And that was in advance of the pandemic, actually. And when I have to have a really difficult conversation with a colleague who may have disrespected me in front of a board meeting, that's discomfort. When I need to ask my partner for a need that's not being met, that's discomfort, right? And often the discomfort becomes so powerful that we then shrink ourselves. We say, oh, maybe it's not worth it. It's not worth addressing. I can't do anything to change my life situation. And so even in my kids, right, we work on practices that build discomfort. And you start small, right? Maybe there's some physical sensation that you don't love to have, but can you sit with it? Can you hold space for it? Can you learn to self-regulate and soothe yourself when the discomfort rises so that when the stakes are higher, you find you can tolerate it more? And so I think when we think about emotional literacy, that's something I never learned from my parents, right? That's something that often they never learned. And so understanding how to harness that knowledge as data, not as good or bad, right? Anger's not good or bad, it's data. And can I take in that data and understand what it's trying to tell me? Because that's the purpose of emotion, right? And so does it drive action? Does it drive some type of change or self-awareness or knowledge? And so I always try to encourage my clients and my kids, don't be scared of your emotion. It is existing to protect you and give you knowledge. And how do you go about understanding that knowledge is the wisdom that you build over time.
That is just so deep. And I would love to even get to the more, maybe the question, which might be for a parent, for an AAPI parent who is saying, how do I even understand my kids' emotions? Are they good? Are they bad? I think let's even go there to that level of advising, or when we can get to it. Becky, it looked like you might have a thought too.
No, I was just honing into what Christine, you just mentioned. I would love to learn a little bit more because what Jenny's doing is building resilience. And I love that concept because, you know, we are exposed constantly with negative emotions. And one of the biggest challenges, how do we turn these negative emotions into positive or even reinforce some of our beliefs? So we'd love to hear a little bit more. And I'm sure in Jenny's book, she probably had provided a lot of insights around that. But I just want to tap in regards to the concept of discomfort. I think one of the things that I encourage the community and other providers to really think about is the language that we are, you know, applying when we're engaging with individuals with a lived condition, and also their family and the community. So language and what we say can create that discomfort. So if we are mindful with the language that we are saying at any of our events, I think that's really important. And even for family members to learn more about the concept of person-centered language so that they are not putting their loved one in this discomfortable situation. I think that is something that I encourage the community. There's a lot of resources on the website. A lot of the mental health organizations like Mental Health America actually have a great infographic about person-centered language. So that's something that I hope the community can tap into when they're speaking to their loved one or family member, or even for their personal education, that, you know, words matter and words can be very hurtful.
Howard?
Yeah, I really like what Becky said there, and it kind of reminds me of sometimes the gap. You know, I'm a psychiatrist, and we focus so much on the technical aspects of care, right? But I think this is also about the dignity of care and thinking about the value of lived experience, which is really that partnership, right, with the person who's coming to you for care, to say, we're going to come up with this plan together. Tell me about your worldview, what's happening, right? Tell me about any cultural pieces that I should know, really, the sense of humility rather than a place of authority as we have these partnerships. I do want to dovetail back to your question about parenting. You know, it's something that we all struggle with. And I'm just going to tell you as a child psychiatrist that there's no respect at home for child psychiatry, you know, so there's no, you know, it's just one of those things that we struggle with. So one thing I've tried and something I learned in training is that I have this great mentor at Mass General Hospital, Dr. Ann Fischel, who's head of the family therapy program for many, many years. She has a national nonprofit called the Family Dinner Project. And really, it's just about the power of having meals together as families, which only about 40% of people do these days, who are all so busy. It doesn't have to be dinner. It could be any meal. But we do that. And I think that dovetails a lot with a lot of Asian cultures, right, where the meal, food is so fundamental, and you spend that time together. But how do you spend that time, right? And what do you talk about during that time? We've tried various things, some with, no success. Something that stuck with us fairly recently, the last year or two, is, you know, I've asked each of my older kids, the three older ones, who are in high school and middle school respectively, to read an article a day, you know, something in the news, and just come talk to us about it. And, you know, going back to what Jenny was saying about points of information, it's so interesting. It's the same reference, and I've often read the same article, but their point of view is so different, right? And it's not just a first, second, third generation Asian piece. It's just so many things, right? Lived experience, and really trying to understand, why did they pick that? Why does this matter? You know, what's the context? Those kind of things. And sprinkling in there, you know, whenever there's a new documentary about Asian Americans, I, you know, force us all to watch it. We watch it together. Sometimes they're not enthusiastic. But interestingly, you know, despite a lot of grumbling, you know, my daughter this last year helped start up an Asian American club at her high school, you know, which sort of was shocking to me, frankly, you know. And so I think that sometimes these seeds that you plant, they don't all spring forth, right? But sometimes they do think about it, and so I think it's that exposure along the way of really being mindful about the time that you do have together.
That's amazing. I'm thinking that our work exposes us to people, and in clinical work, they're the people who have come to us already, either whether it's outpatient or inpatient. In the larger space, which I know you all three work in as well, there's a lot of room for the decision to even figure out if a mental health struggle is something to pay attention to from a, a clinical standpoint, or to take seriously. I think parents struggle with, what is normal teenage stuff, what is something I need to just get them to like crack down and be more disciplined. So in a way, like, I would love to just hear your thoughts about, let's phrase it, the concept of, let's say, giving grace and a benefit of the doubt, that if a kid is behaving differently and maybe not behaving well from the parent standpoint, could it be that there's actually something going on with regard to their mental health, versus an immediate sort of judgment that, you better knock that off and get to work harder. Just, let's talk about that grace versus assumption of judgment a little bit.
So, Christine, I would love to chime in first, because I think the way we position the conversation and how we ask the questions is critical. I have a 16-year-old, but I also have a cousin who had been suffering with depression for decades. And one of the things she shared with me is that, oftentimes people would just come up to her and say, "How are you doing?" or "Where have you been?" They're probing, they're asking really intrusive questions. And one of the things she recommended is that, most of us just want to, have people approach us and say, "Lately, I noticed you've been acting this way. Can we talk a little bit more?" So instead of asking like probing questions, I think maybe we need to step back and approach it differently, and even listening from the person with the lived experience on how do they want to interact, or what do you want me to do for you when I notice that you're showing signs of relapse, or you're showing some symptoms. And I think that's important, is to have that discussion and to not minimize when you do notice that there is some behavior changes, or if you start noticing their grades are dropping, or they stop participating, or enjoying certain things that they enjoy doing. So one of the advice I would give as a parent is really don't minimize anything. And it's not just, obviously your kids, but then also look at your other loved ones, especially if there is a behavior change.
Absolutely. Others, Howard?
Well, I'm a child psychiatrist, and when I'm on call, I'm often responding to consults in the hospital of someone that survived a suicide attempt, right? A teenager, typically, sometimes a older, elementary school child, but usually teenager, middle school, high school. And, just as Becky was saying, don't minimize. Sometimes there's this stigma that people are just attention seeking, right? You hear that sometimes said by clinicians, sometimes by people. It's just saying, putting people down, right? That they're just looking for attention. But so often, the people that I see in the hospital after an attempt, suicide attempt, is they've done it quietly, right? And when you sit down and talk with them and ask them, who would you actually talk to? And sometimes they don't have anybody, right? Some of them, sometimes it's the parents. I would say rarely is it the parents that they would say that they would talk to. Oftentimes it's a peer, a teenager, as well. And oftentimes these peers are holding these tremendous secrets of their friends' mental health crises silently, from all sorts of really devastating things, breakups, trauma, all sorts of really weighty things that happen. So I would say, along with what Becky said about take it seriously, I would also say it's really important, probably incumbent upon us, to think about training up all of us to be recognizing and be just more fluent in mental health, right? So thinking about schools, what kind of resources are available there, understanding that many therapists, many child psychiatrists are way backed up, even if you want to seek care, right? It's not like if you call the hotline right away, you're going to get somebody tomorrow. Oftentimes there's wait lists and a lot of people aren't taking new patients, right? So I think we need to expand the workforce and just recognize that many of us might be the first one to be asked to help, even if we're not necessarily the expert.
Christine, may I chime in to Howard was mentioning about education? I do want to inform the community that some of the states have now offered mental health education K to 12. New York State was the first state that is now offering that early education. And to what Howard was sharing is that the early detection, the early, identity where people can identify with certain symptoms and seek in treatment early on can ensure the success and also help destigmatize and create the barriers that we are seeing right now. So I hope in the next decade, more states will be aligned where they are offering mental health education in the public school or in all the schools early on.
Absolutely. Jenny?
Yeah, I think, as a parent and also as, somebody who works with parents, one of the most powerful things we can offer our kids is psychological safety. Because that's not something their friends necessarily can offer them. That's not always something their teachers or coaches can offer. You hope so, right? In most cases, there is. But how are we building up psychological safety in our homes? Do we use shame as a source of motivation? Do we expect compliance over connection with our kids, right? And when I think about the kind of traditional stereotype of kind of Asian parenting, you don't get really warm and fuzzy feelings sometimes, right? We've heard of the tiger parent. And it's not to say that's a bad thing, right? We want the best for our children. And we think by motivating them through perhaps this harshness or criticalness is the way to do it. But if that is the model, then when they hit really difficult situations, like Howard mentioned, trauma, right? Breakups, heartache, will they come to you? Do you offer the warmth and safety that they will come to you? Or will they feel like they cannot? They're too scared, right? And so as parents, when I engage my children over grades even, and the report card comes home, I have to be mindful of how I talk about that with them. Am I valuing a letter over their personhood, their worth? Or am I trying to be a teacher in that moment and inquire from them how they feel about the report card, right? So there are ways in which we can build that safety around them so that when they're teenagers, when they're older adults, they still feel like they can come back and seek refuge with us. And I think that's what allows them to speak up about their mental health.
Those are just such pearls of wisdom. And, I'm just thinking about what we learn from our kids and about our kids that you don't always know in the early years of your children's lives. And they can be so different from one another. Later in our 21-year-old's life, when they were a teenager, we realized, oh my goodness, all of this, sort of more hard-nosed expectations. This was a child who was heaping on guilt and shame, and you didn't need to just open your mouth, let alone, say anything, and they would assume that they were in trouble. And it took us a while to realize that between our first child and our second child, they really would have done ideally better with very different approaches. And that's part of the challenge, of course. But I really love what you're saying about the psychological safety. And I think where we as parents struggle is, when is it time to push harder? And there is a time for that. And to stick with rules and, consequences, natural consequences, or a reward system, and when to balance with really prioritizing what you're saying, which I think it comes the least naturally to most parents, let alone in Asian culture, with regard to this loving, accepting, supporting, listening mode. I mean, I do say, just hearing myself even say all that, like, listening will never be the wrong approach, probably in any of these, scenarios and spaces. But Any other comments on this? Because I think these are real struggles that parents have, and let alone for the parents and families where there is somebody who is struggling mightily with a severe or worsening mental health condition, and where access to care can be such a challenge. Those are absolutely real, obviously, realities that people are facing. And maybe, I guess, all the more reason to not assume that even for non-mental health trained family members, there is such an important role to play in just being with them and supporting them during those difficult moments where there are not easy solutions. There's no quick fixes around, especially more severe mental health conditions and struggles. Any other comments about that, Howard?
Well, I would just say a couple of things. I love what Jenny was saying just about psychological safety. And I'm just going to pair it with humility, because I think that, I know as a father, I blow it a lot, right? I mean, you try to do your best, but then sometimes, you're not at your best and you snap at someone, and, but it kind of goes back to what you're saying, Christine, too, about spending that time. There's a colleague of mine who also has 4 kids, and he once told me that he would take his kids on one-on-one trips, and I started doing that actually about 3 or 4 years ago, and it actually is one of the best things that we've ever done as parents. And my wife and I, my wife's a family doc, we divide it up and we alternate the kids, and just such a different experience. And you realize that there's a different way to experience the parenting relationship if you just take it under different contexts, right? And then to recognize then again that sometimes we argue at home. Those kind of things are okay to normalize, right? Arguing as parents or parent and child, versus silence, or you just go to your room, or those kind of things. That's important to model as well. It's not always about repressing some of these important debates about how do we spend our time. And in our own household, we're having this discussion about, well, so many lessons, so much driving, all these things. What about intentional fun family time? How do we carve that out?
Yes.
So I think those are really important debates to have, discussions to have, and just acknowledging it's not easy, and no one has a perfect solution. But sometimes with the same amount of time, we can spend it differently, and I think it's something worth being intentional about, Christine, to your point.
Yeah, I would want all parents to know, if there was any doubt in your mind, having laughter and levity, lightness, game time, that is helpful to brain development. It's not just a fluffy thing. It's not a waste of time, quite the opposite. So I think, right, there's so many things that we could do in terms of like just the everyday things that we build into our schedules and our family time. I know one thing that we did that you reminded me of, Howard, is my husband and I would take turns having one-on-one, we called them date nights with our kids. And the kid got to choose whatever it was. And, there were times when it was like Lego for 3 hours. But, to just really have that one-on-one, it is so different than the larger family dynamic, oftentimes. This is like unbelievable, but we're already coming to the close of our time together. And I'd like to give each of you a moment, because it goes by so fast, and other ideas and thoughts might have come to mind, or scenarios. So let's just go around and give each person an opportunity, if there was something, to kind of develop that out a little bit further, or if not, to just, give your warm wishes to the community and any closing comments. So Becky, why don't we start with you?
Sure. I think to end on a nice note, I want to encourage compassion for all the family and all the caregivers and all, everyone in the community, that we do have to have grace on ourselves. We are human. It's okay if our kids don't turn out great. It's okay if there's lots of bumps along the way, but really have compassion for yourself and take good care of yourself before you can take care of other people. So, that this is so critical. And I feel like a lot of times, we're so focused on, being the caretaker, being the parent, and especially with some of our healthcare professional colleagues, we are constantly, experiencing compassion fatigue. So if you start realizing that, your empathy meter is quite low, maybe it's a good time to take a mental health holiday for yourself as well. I always think self-care is critical. If we're not doing well, how can we expect our kids to do well? How can we expect our people around us to, look up to us, do well as well?
Amazing. Thank you. Howard, any last thoughts?
I would just say that I love what was said by Becky, and self-care is so important. As part of that, I just read an article just about the value of friendship, even separate from your partner in life, just because it's something fundamental. And so many of us, as we're seeking to break through these glass ceilings and bamboo ceilings, whatever you might call it, for leadership in different areas, you end up being the first or the only, right? And so I would say that something I've learned, especially in the pandemic, is to really take the time to find other people. Like, this conversation is very soul satisfying for me, to hear different paths, along a common theme, but really finding others who have a similar passion wherever they are, right? And making sure you take the time to connect, have coffee, talk about life tips and pearls and struggles, those kind of things. That's really important. So there's been a rising epidemic of loneliness. The Surgeon General's pointed that out multiple times. Young people, old people, all sorts of people are in that group, right, that are vulnerable. I would say Asian Americans are also in that group, particularly in the pandemic, right? And we need to think about how do we find those connections and really make the time for them. I think that's fundamental.
Amazing. Thank you. And Jenny.
When I think about what is powerful, especially in our community, I think it is when we work on ourselves, right? When I show up as a warm, loving mother, a partner, a friend, a daughter, a sister, when I am experiencing groundedness, people co-regulate to me. And so if there's an impact that we can make, we can start with ourselves, right? Maybe you need to start therapy, or maybe you need to consider medication, or finding time with friends, or finding time with your partner, right? And I think this idea that when I'm feeling grounded, I can hold space for others that feel safe and grounded, right? And I can be humble without letting my ego get triggered, right? And so I think that especially within our community where the stigma is so high and the shame can be so high, when I tell my kids, oh, mommy has therapy today, I'm breaking some of that stigma right then and there. And when I tell my parents, right, that I'm doing therapy today, that's normalizing that idea even for that generation. So we're doing it forward, and we're also doing it back with our parents. And so if we all focused first on improving our own mental health, I think that ripple effect in our community could be so powerful. And I always say, could we think about giving others the gift of going second? When I can be vulnerable first and say, I'm struggling, it gives that other person the gift of also saying, me too. And I think that's what allows us to improve mental health.
That is so beautiful. Thank you so much to the three of you. My goodness, self-care, connection, vulnerability, authenticity, taking that risk. It invites a deeper level of connection and for others to get the help that they need. And I'll just add one thing that we're practicing now more than ever in my family, and that is a growth mindset that moves away from a shame-based perfectionistic way of thinking, which is an illusion anyway. And it says it's progress, not perfection. And we will make mistakes, and we're allowed to do that. And we learn at each moment, and we pick ourselves back up, and we can be honest about it, and we can support one another along the way. Those are new constructs to live by, probably in any family for the most part, but certainly in AAPI communities. So we just want to thank everyone so much for taking the time to join us in this conversation. We hope that you've taken something useful from it. We will link to all of the AAPI mental health resources that AFSP has put together. And we hope that we've gotten to all of your questions along the way as well. So thank you so, so much, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care.